Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. To look around you at the state of the world today, one might almost forgive people for longing for the zombie apocalypse. Probably the most significant figure of horror for the contemporary world. The zombie represents the inhuman within the human, or the post-human within the human, and its very familiarity somehow stands right alongside its continued force to shock and amuse us in a peculiar fashion that has drawn a great deal of cultural commentary. The zombie, at least in its more contemporary guise, being such a relatively recent baddie, unlike ghosts and ghouls and vampires and various other creatures drawn from more traditional sources, except for the fact that the zombie itself has its origins within a particular tradition, within Haitian voodoo and the environment of African American, in the broad sense of the Americas, Afro-Caribbean religiosity that has also played a really strong role in the kind of contemporary mind frame of horror. But what's the connection between these two zombies, between the shuffling, revived cadaver of the Haitian countryside, working mindlessly in a sort of allegory of slavery? What connects that creature to our modern contemporary zombie apocalypse, with the hordes of creatures looking for nothing more than to eat our brains? This question is at the core of the book by our guest today. John Cussans is a artist, writer, and educator based in London. He's also a PKD fan, and we've talked about Valis and Dick's own experience in British Columbia before, and maybe we'll get to that later in the show. But right now we're talking to John because of Undead Uprising, Haiti, Horror, and the Zombie Complex, a new book that's come out on Strange Attractor Books with a very handsome cover full of all sorts of creatures and ghouls. And in the book, John does a remarkably thorough job of tracing the history of the zombie figure from its origins and discussions around Haiti, and fears and fascination with that particularly sort of evocative land, which plays such a significant role, especially in the American context of a kind of familiar other. And we'll get into that. And tracing the history of the zombie as it develops through popular culture, through fiction, and particularly through cinema, and as it evolves through the Romero sequence and seemingly leaves some of its Haitian context, although always carrying on some of the fascinating dialectics and allegorical imports of this particular figure. And so it's as a fan of voodoo and of Haiti, I've been to Haiti a couple of times, though many decades ago now. I actually went there with one of the authors that John draws from in his book, which is kind of funny. So there's something uncannily familiar about some of these topics to me, and it was a great read. So I look forward to talking to John, and here he is. John, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Yeah, hi Eric, nice to be here.
Yeah, very good. You know, I want to get into your book, but I think it might be a fun way to set the stage to have you talk a little bit about your dissertation, which was on Bataille and the video nasty controversy, which will probably not be known about by many of our listeners, and is a kind of fascinating insight into a particularly UK sort of phantasmagoria involving censorship and exploitation cinema. So I just like to hear a little bit about what what led to that being your project and how it connected with Bataille. And it seems like that's a good place to begin understanding your attraction and interest in the zombie complex.
Yeah, cool. No, that's good. It's kind of it's a kind of well-rehearsed narrative for myself, so I can do it easily here. I was studying for a master's degree in art history and theory many years ago, and I was doing something on the Spanish painter Tapies, and my supervisor said I should look at an essay on something called base materialism in a collection of essays about Georges Bataille, who I'd never heard of. And when I read those essays, read Bataille for the first time, I was suddenly reminded of the horror films that I'd watched as a kid, mainly Hammer horror, but also some kind of TV thriller shows. And I suddenly realized I was really more interested in those than I was in Tapies's paintings. And I asked if I could write a thesis about the powers of horror and the attraction of horror. And Bataille seemed to legitimate a form of culture that I was immersed in as a kid, but didn't think was a legitimate field for academic research. So I began approaching horror from a Bataillean perspective, and eventually wrote a PhD thesis about Bataille and the video nasty controversy. Now, for your American listeners, the video nasty is a term that was introduced in the UK in the early 1980s, when there was it's very much tied to the emergence of VHS and video, and the fact that videos were not controllable in the same way movies that went to the cinema were. So for a movie to go to the cinema, it needed to go through the British Board of Film Classification, get a certificate, X, XXX, whatever the rating was, to control the audiences. Whereas you could go to a video store and get any film you wanted, and no one even checked your ID. So there was a bit of a moral panic emerged around a number of films, Driller Killer, Evil Dead, and others, that kids were watching them, and that this was very dangerous for society. And so there was a kind of moral panic raised by the tabloid press, and the Director of Public Prosecutions compiled a list of 72 films, which the tabloid press called video nasties. And these were films which were so beyond the pale that the government needed to do something about it to stop young children, particularly adolescents, being exposed to films with gratuitous violence and sexuality that hadn't been classified by the British Board of Film Censors. So they were the video nasties. And I wanted to look at those films from a Bataillean perspective, which really, basically, Bataille's kind of had an idea of existential horror as being something with revolutionary potential. So being exposed to images of extreme transgression, blood sacrifice, somehow had an intoxicating effect, which was tied in complex ways, which is probably too much to go into here, with Bataille's theory of revolution in the 1930s. So my question was, is there any way in which these films could be revolutionary? So I looked at films like Faces of Death, Last House on the Left, I Spit on Your Grave, and I think particularly pertinent would be Cannibal Holocaust. So that's what I did for my PhD. I wrote about those films, and what was particularly important in the discourse of censorship around them is this notion of the copycat effect, that these films were so powerful that they could induce people to go out and commit similar kinds of acts. And there was even some claims, which were kind of Bataillean, that they would even lead to, fascism or perhaps communism, or they would have some powerful social impact if they weren't suppressed by the authorities. So in many ways, the censors and the people who believed in the power of video nasties were more kind of sympathetic to Bataille's worldview than the people who said, well, actually, these films are really harmless and anybody should be able to watch them and it isn't going to affect them. It's kind of a superstition and mumbo-jumbo to think that these films could enter people's minds and kind of take over their consciousness. So, so that's how I got into this particular set of issues and concerns.
Yeah, that's an interesting attention. I had never really quite thought about it that way. And you see the same thing, let's say, in the discussion of, violent computer games, is that there's this kind of contradiction where, on the one hand, you want these things to be transformative, whether in the revolutionary context that you are looking at, or if you're looking at, possible new forms of society or new ways to be together, or how to how to explore the mind, all these sort of different higher goals, let's say, that you find on top of, some people who are advocate for computer games. And then at the same time, any suggestion that there's a sort of negative consequence, that there's a copycat effect, that people, develop the ability, more of a facility for violence, or it becomes more automatic. Then we switch to the other thing. Well, this is just entertainment. It's no big deal. It's just don't take it too seriously. And I think that split is in a lot of us about these. We want these vehicles to be transformative in some way, and yet the dark side of transformation. We don't want to think about that. It's no big deal. It's just entertainment, and in a way, that's sort of the dialectic of entertainment. It's like it's just a show, but if at some point you don't think it's more than just a show, then it's not a very good show.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, that's the kind of Bataille really opens up that optic, as you're very familiar with Bataille too, that, you can't only have all the good side of things. If you're going for complete transformation or radical transformation of subjectivity or thought or anything, it doesn't just come, with the good package. There's always the risk, there's always the underside, there's always the chance that you take that you're going to have a bad trip. You're going to be, fighting off demons for, the foreseeable. And that's the risk that you take by entering into the challenge that radical culture offers to consciousness and to society. But it can't always be the good. It can't always be on the progressive side necessarily in bringing about some, brighter future for everybody exposed to it.
Well, we will get to the zombie, but I've been thinking about this issue, and I'm curious how you think about it. That the whole gesture towards transgressive culture, which let's say I probably first encountered in the 1980s when I was interested in amok books, and sort of there was kind of this weird post-punk culture interested in serial killers and this whole kind of domain. Including videos and things like this, and there's been kind of at least in that framework, a long-standing sort of zone of popular culture that is aggressively transgressive, and it went into performance art and the circus stuff in the 90s, and Joel Coleman's art, and there's so many elements of it. And it always seemed to me that there was this kind of radical potential, whether an explicitly political revolutionary force, I'm not so sure, but certainly in terms of a radical a sense of possibility, of transgression, of challenging cultural norms, et cetera, et cetera. But everything is so weird today. Everything is so confusingly dialectical in the sense that it's like the most transgressive is now ad copy for, for whatever name your corporation. And then at the same time, there's this sense that we're still locked into something that could do with some transgression. So I'm just curious for you whether maybe that was even partly your interest in the zombie project, is that it added more explicitly historical dimension to some of these issues brought up with horror and transgression. Because in my impression, and I want to hear your response as well, that impulse got, in a way, or that potential got a bit played out, let's say, in postmodernity, that there was a way in which there was a charge, there was certainly a charge for Bataille, but that increasingly people who were making those gestures were kind of simply iterating their own kind of cultural identity, and that there was some kind of way in which the law itself changed enough that didn't have that bite anymore. And I'm curious whether you see this as a passing phase, this kind of transgressive possibility, or whether it continues to be available in the experience of the abject, of the outside, of death, of sexual transgression, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And let me try and answer it as best I can. For sure, you talk about, sort of the death culture, apocalypse culture, and muck journal. That was all the stuff too that I was into at the same time, late 80s, early 90s. It kind of set a milieu, a context. That was the same time as the video nasties. It was all happening around the same time in the mid to late 80s. That's the same time Bataille kind of became academically acceptable. The Manchester University Press, Visions of Excess, the October edition. People started talking about transgression in a milieu where there was a lot of transgression in the culture, a lot of question about that. I think that what happened in the middle of the 90s was that it kind of coincided with a kind of simulation debate, the postmodern, but particularly the Baudrillard debate, where this idea that, there was a kind of sense that capitalism could capture anything. It hadn't quite got there yet, but even something like snuff films, which in the, at that time, right in the early 90s when Cussans and Slater wrote their book Killing for Culture, snuff films were a myth at that point. People had talked about them. They were reputedly films, but, all the films like, Cannibal Holocaust or Faces of Death, it's now recognized that all those things were simulated. So transgression and excess moved into this realm of simulation, the kind of Baudrillard moment. And then you go in this kind of like Bataille in Videodrome sort of world where everything became very strange, especially in the late 90s. And I was very much wrapped up in a kind of sim, death cult, fantasy type arena where kind of, Gibson, Blade Runner, Count Zero, and Neuromancer, the whole kind of idea that, there might be some capture of excess in the interest of some, insidious capitalist spectacle that is actually a form of control in Burroughs' sense. And all these were the kind of, Death at the Parasite Cafe, these kind of discourses with a really radical cutting edge of thinking running up to the millennium as I understood it. And but things kind of ran away in some ways after that. So now, by the other side of the noughties, we have, YouTube ads or Google ads, coming up against, jihadi beheading videos, that you can actually see people being murdered for propagandistic purposes if you want to. It's actually come to fruition, the things that we thought were kind of science fiction fantasies, plus all the video nasties, which were considered to be, deeply disturbing and challenging to our normative social values, are now available on the internet. You can buy them at, your local video record store. With Cannibal Holocaust, there's no deluxe editions. There's, so this idea that transgressive culture had some radically subversive revolutionary potential seems to have been annulled very much by what's actually happened. Another thing I'd say about that is that I kind of retreated from the higher level philosophical debates and theoretical debates around transgression, simulation, the kind of hypermediatization of society and the implications of that. And I did want to ground the discussion and debates around the zombie figure in a real, concrete history. So I kind of withdrew from the kind of more abstract theoretical debates, which seemed to be going round in circles. And I wanted to just tell a kind of a simple story of the path of the zombie from Haitian folklore to apocalyptic flesh-eating marauder in kind of quite sober terms, really. Careful, considered terms, to try and get out of that hyper-real simulation snuff cult kind of area that seemed to be characteristic of things into the noughties.
Well, it makes it a really strong book because you do all of that rigorous history. You did a tremendous amount of research, and you lay out a story that's largely chronological and has a lot of room for particular issues in the history of politics and economics, as well as in the horror complex and the kind of the psychosexual dimension of these things. But it's at the same time, it's still enlivened by that extra weirdness, if you will, that makes it not at all a dry read. But it seems like a good place to start out. I mean, it's a huge topic, but I think you talk about it in your book, is just a little bit about the role that Haiti as a place, as a particular historical environment, as this radical revolutionary space what role it kind of plays in whatever the Euro-American imagination. It's very distinct. There's nothing like Haiti in the way that it's been demeaned, and the way in which it's been recognized as different, as exceptional, as not like other Caribbean countries or other countries in the New World. And there's something about that quality that goes into the zombie figure, even into its contemporary transformation. So, well, say a little bit about that kind of the particular qualities of Haiti that set up the zombie fascination that will come.
Yeah, well, it came out of the Bataille research into video nasties, and particularly this copycat effect in terms of how I was drawn to it. It didn't really figure on the horizon of my research. I knew about Maya Deren. I knew about Gibson talking about contacting the lower on the matrix. I knew something about voodoo, but it wasn't a particularly high-profile idea until I researched the history of this idea of the copycat effect, but also contagious behavior and mass hypnosis. And when you start looking into the history of anxieties about mass manipulation and demonic possession as a contagious phenomena, you quickly go back to writers like Gustave Le Bon, who makes a link between the behavior of people in a hypnotic trance, somnambulists, and primitives, or people who aren't guided by rational, reasonable impulses. And it was when I was researching that history that I found out that Anton Mesmer, the inventor of hypnotism, or animal magnetism, but basically, roughly speaking, it became hypnotism or somnambulistic trance, had claimed that he was responsible for the founding of the Republic of Haiti, where the slaves had mistaken animal magnetism with sorcery, and the colonial regime was ended in a bloodbath. Now, this was a wild idea, I thought, until I then began to research the history of mesmerism in Haiti. And what you find is very precisely this coincidence between the somnambulist and the zombie figure. And they both seem to intersect through Haiti. You get a film like White Zombie, the first zombie film, 1931, where there's a white woman who is in a somnambulistic trance, who may or may not be a zombie. And in the early phase of zombie films, the somnambulist and the zombie coincide. What's weirder about that is that there was mesmerism in Haiti prior to the revolution. And in fact, when you look at the historical records, it turns out that the colonial authorities seemed to believe that the natives, or the slaves, were mixing their African religions with animal magnetism, and they were very concerned about it right before the revolution. So there's this strange coincidence of the way in which the narrative of the zombie in cinema coincides with that of the somnambulist, having some historical reality in what was going on in Haiti. Moreover, many of the followers of Mesmer were abolitionists who preached the evils of slavery, Republican abolitionists. So they were in Haiti preaching abolition, preaching republicanism, and practicing this thing which looked very close to some of the practices that voodoo was involved in, most notably, of course, possession trance, which is what both practices shared. So what I found was that Haiti just emerged on the horizon of this. There's two strands: the mesmerized somnambulist and the living dead person, both of which are what I call in the book agents without autonomy, but importantly, remotely controlled agents without autonomy. So they're both figures who have no will of their own, can't tell you what they're thinking. They're actants. They're going to do something. But what they're going to do is not governed by their own will or their own intention. It's governed from the outside by some other force. And this is very much how the colonial authorities saw the voodoo dances, and particularly the Papaloa, Mamaloa voodoo dances, where the authorities believed that the voodoo priests and priestesses had special control over the slaves, and that this was a very dangerous control which might lead to uncontrollable behavior, which it seemed to do through the possession trance dances that were taking place in Haiti, sometimes in secret, sometimes more publicly on Saturday and Sunday nights when the slaves were allowed to gather and dance. So
Well,
I found that.
you mentioned what William Burroughs and the idea of control a moment ago, and that seems to be one of the interesting things about this figure, about the zombie figure, is that the problem of control gets raised in sort of on multiple dimensions. It's not just the idea that the possessed person is controlled by, let's say, the head priest, or controlled by the god, but at the same time there's the whole issue of control over enslaved bodies. So then you have this very different kind of organization of control, and then those issues get inflamed by all these questions about crowds, about mass manipulation, and those too become part of the story, especially later when we have the hordes of zombies in the kind of post Night of the Living Dead area, where there's something about the way that control, which you think should be very clear, the issues raised by control, actually, the more you look at it, the more it sort of shivers and shimmers into multiple dimensions, some of which are spectral and occult, and some of which are super gnarly, are very political and very violent. How did you kind of find yourself following this question, particularly of control and possession, which is something else that you play with the multiple meanings of in this context of, on the one hand, the occult, and on the other hand, modern capitalism?
Yeah, well, interesting. It's great. You sort of nailed it. It's Burroughs. I mean, my first real insight into the theory of control and notions of control was reading Burroughs. In particular, Our Pook is Here, which is, something that I listen to over and over again. The Mayan control machine, control needs time in which to exercise control. I was always fascinated by this idea of a kind of external agency of control somehow, shaping and informing our behaviors without our knowing it. So Burroughs really already had, and, from his own experience, very much linked to addiction, which is also a very important theme that runs throughout the zombie figure, the idea of potions and tinctures, or, the drug control. So I came at control from Burroughs, and also through Wilhelm Reich, and his reading of his relationship to Freud. So, I did all that psychoanalytic stuff, like around the superego, the ego, what is this controlling set of ideas that we associate with authority figures. So, I went through all that kind of work, that kind of direction. But, Burroughs was the first person to alert me to the idea that there are extrinsic systems of control that we may or may not be aware of, that are governing our behavior, our thought patterns, and our actions. I mean, for Burroughs, it was very obviously fundamentally controlled, related to language. I followed Burroughs into general semantics, which is perhaps one of the best mental hygiene procedures I think you can go through in order to try and unsnip the word and image lines that keep you controlled by this apparatus, whatever or whoever control is or is not. So, Burroughs was the person that got me really interested in this kind of thinking. But Burroughs isn't in the book. So you nailed it with Burroughs.
And then that, in a way, there's something about that same dynamic or a similar form of it that goes into this question of possession. Because when you're possessed, your consciousness is gone, your personality is temporarily in abeyance, and there's this other being that is in your place. And at the same time, possession is also this domain of ownership. That slaves are that's what defines a slave, is that they're actually possessed by their masters. And so we have this like incredibly rich allegory right off the bat in terms of zombie as slave, and that's something that you talk about in your analysis of White Zombie, the film, because we see the enslaved zombies, working in the factory over and over again alongside this more European story of somnambulism and a kind of Svengali character. So there's all these anxieties going on in this certainly in the cinematic representations of the zombie. What are some other things going on? What led the zombie to be embraced, at least originally in the 30s and 40s, as this kind of horror figure? What else was going on at that time that made it that added energy to the figure?
Well, the weird thing is, the zombie in the 1920s and 30s, it became a way of displacing a lot of anxieties about manipulation and control onto, supernatural or mystical forces, which at least in the case of Haiti, were kind of to do with a kind of some notion of, superstitious mumbo jumbo. At the same time, there was a kind of displacement of the reality of the feeling of being controlled by forces above and beyond our own will and control. And there's a moment there where you can see the Great Depression. You see the notion of capitalism being something which is out of control, but affecting people's lives in ways that they can't really do anything about. So there's a parallel there between the kind of unemployed laborer and the zombie, which White Zombie talks about. But at the same time, it conceals the fact that the American authorities had introduced forced labor into Haiti during their occupation from 1915 to 1936. So literally, when William Seabrook, who's the person who in the Magic Island brings to the Western world the zombie, in a chapter from that book, it's the first time it enters into the English language, and people start to recognize what it is. He doesn't draw the parallel between the fact that those zombies were working for the Haitian American Sugar Corporation, literally for an American Haitian corporation, which was using forced labor as the American military were doing. And so this link between the revenant of the plantation slavery system, which, of course, everything about Haiti, everything about Haitian self-identity politically is about having broken the chains of slavery. It was the first slave-free republic on the planet. It was the first place in the world to fully and thoroughly abolish slavery. So its sense of self-identity is absolutely not being reduced to slavery again. So when the Americans come and introduce forced labor, it's one of the great humiliations of Haitian national identity to be forced to work again by foreigners. It's a massive insult. It was a huge insult to Haitian self-determination. So the zombie reemerges precisely when, as a revenant of plantation slavery, during the American occupation. That's not widely recognized at the time outside of Haiti, because a lot of that was going on, it was not reported. But at the same time, the zombie figure migrates into Western popular culture precisely when that's happening. But sort of one of the kind of conceits or the narratives that I kind of work through is this idea that perhaps this figure is sort of forced into new territories, or perhaps it has a mission. Perhaps it's actually a kind of sentinel of some kind that keeps its links to Haiti kind of secret or underground, but it keeps that thread going. So my hope is that the zombie figure, despite the fact that it has no autonomy, it can't speak for itself, it can never represent itself, somehow as a trope will lead us all back to recognizing where it came from, which is this unbearable reality of a plantation economy in which human beings were treated as objects. And that's never really been fully resolved in Western ethics, philosophy, morality. We're still have to come to terms with what it means to reduce a human being to an object, to a commodity, to a piece of property, and make it do whatever you want to do until it's dead.
It's very strong words there, because especially from an American context, I mean, when I, thinking of all the issues around racism in the States right now, and the way that it's bubbled up more in the last, few years, 5 years, for all sorts of reasons. And we spend hours talking about those, but one thing that always struck me is that one of the problems here is that even in a kind of notional sense, American society hasn't really gone through, let's call it a truth and reconciliation process, like a real acknowledgement of what it means to enslave. Even if people historically, many cultures did it, it's not a particular white strain or capitalist stain. It's not a universal human practice, but certainly widely distributed. Nonetheless, within the context of the states and where its wealth came from and all of that, it's just there's this point that cannot be looked at. It's almost like one of these horror films. Like you can't actually look at the thing directly. You got to look to the side or whatever. And your presentation of the zombie invites us to peel back the contemporary, more kind of comic book layers, let's say, of the feral insurrectionary army of speechless, brain-seeking zombies, and to find politics, history, and ultimately the particular horror of slavery as a kind of figure that stays with us. It can't go away because it's intrinsic to the story, even though it continues to be repressed in a lot of ways. So, given that kind of framework, how and why does the zombie figure change from this folkloric figure, which is a black body mostly associated with Haiti or with the plantation system, brought back to life through some kind of occult magic, and then it shifts into this sort of more modern sense with Night of the Living Dead, 1968. We get a different kind of zombie, though there's still traces of the older one. Why did that carry forward in that way? Why didn't they just come up with a new name? Why did it remain zombie, or as a sort of a term that we continue to use?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, what happens is you have this classic phase of zombie films, the early ones, like I watched for the Zombie, White Zombie, which are the two standout films in the early phase. By the 1940s, it's become a kind of joke figure, a kind of spooky, fun figure. And in the book, I mentioned one of the most interesting chapters in the book is where I look at the Baron Samedi figure in James Bond's Live and Let Die, and its relationship to black ops of the British intelligence and American intelligence services, where they put German figures in zombie films, King of the Zombies, etc., to try and bring America on the side with Europe for the Second World War by suggesting that the Germans had influence in the Caribbean. But around that time, it was still kind of it's become increasingly a comical figure. Through the 50s too, it'd be kind of real B-movie, spooky, fun figure. And it wasn't until Night of the Living Dead that comical, shuffling, slightly ridiculous Living Dead figure that can be made to walk over a cliff or, point it in the other direction, it'll go and kill somebody else, took on a new lease of life, but obviously, or unlife, should we say. But what was interesting about that was that when Romero made this, and I'm sure you know this, it's kind of a well-known fact, he didn't call them zombies. They didn't have a particular name for them, but the nearest thing would have been ghouls. They wanted to play because, zombies didn't eat people. So they become newly cannibalistic. They had certain features which had evolved, like, not being able to withstand bullets, and, this shoot them in the head thing had already evolved, which Romero picked up on. But they were ghouls. They were and ghouls are figures that live in graveyards. They may be dead, may be alive, but they feast on decaying human flesh. That's what a ghoul does. So, but very quickly, the response was that people started calling them zombies, and then there was a spate of Italian films like Zombie Flesh Eaters, which followed on, and the name just stuck. So it kind of, there was this break point where these were very different not entirely different kinds of beings. They were still living dead, risen from the grave, corpse, cadaver in the Haitian sense, but they weren't controlled by bokors or Hungans or remote agents who were, making them do things. They were driven by pure carnality, pure hunger, the need to feed. So they become this very different kind of entity with similarities, but the name stuck, and the name is what we understand it to be today. But there's definitely a break point when that happens. And in the book, I talk about the fact that in many ways, the zombie becomes, I call it deracinated. It's like its roots in the politics of race in Haiti and slavery, and kind of moved away from But my sense is that the zombie apocalypse is a kind of a desublimated racial holocaust that can't speak its name, or a kind of revenge for the profoundly unresolved injustices of slavery, which would never, as you say, there'd never been a truth and reconciliation. And that was very clear, the fact that as Romero was taking the film to New York the same day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, this and the civil rights the references to the civil rights movement in the film itself, it was quite clear that there was and Black Power was emergent and very strong at that time. So the race politics were around at the time. They were super part of what was going on in America in the 1960s. But the zombie figure sort of moved off in a slightly different direction. But I still think it carries that sublimated rage with it. So that's my understanding of it.
That's interesting. I'm wondering how is that something that other people, since there's so much discourse on zombies, I mean, there's so many people who are analyzing this figure. Is that something that comes up? Is that do you think people are acknowledging that?
There's a whole kind of contemporary kind of theory around zombies, the flesh eating variety, the apocalyptic flesh eating variety, that has seen that figure as representing various marginalized subaltern groups who are subject to what Agamben calls the logic of the camp, the extermination camp or the refugee camp. So the zombie becomes a kind of allegory for any kind of marginalized group that is subject to the totalitarian logic of extermination. So with that in mind, it becomes any group that can be killed at will, that is bare life, that is beyond any reasonable necessity to treat as a human being. So it becomes much more generalized as this kind of bare life figure. So what it does is it becomes much more of a catch-all category for any kind of identity which can be seen to be exterminated in certain circumstances. And it loses its specificity as having its roots in the politics of race and plantation slavery. So it gains a kind of wider demographic, if you like, underneath its potential representations, but it loses the specificity of the plantation economy and the unresolved politics of race and enlightenment that Western philosophy is still working through.
So do you think it can still be that it needs to sort of uncover that history to be more politically forceful, or is there a sort of power as well in the kind of openness of the contemporary zombie, where it's no longer linked to a particular history? It becomes, in a way, a kind of new universal subject, except it's the subject that's not a subject. That's precisely the sign of where the subject is prevented from going, because you have to externalize these no longer humans or non-humans in order to control them. Is there still a politics there in that newer zombie form?
I think the philosophy, the political philosophy of the zombie hasn't changed so much from reactions to the Haitian Revolution on the part of European white supremacists, conservatives, and others. I think it's not that big a difference, in fact. The zombies come a long way, as it were, but my understanding is the politics we're still dealing with around blackness, about race, around race invisibility, around Black Lives Matter, and all the politics attending that. Why is it? We've got the prison industrial complex, and et cetera, all the things we know about disproportionate incarceration of black people in America and other parts of the world. We know all this. And I don't think we have actually, the zombie figure, the problem, if you trace the apocalyptic zombie back through its various phases back to Haiti, we're still at the Haitian Revolution and responses to that. It was a black revolution, and it defined the white world in a way, as the whites were those who were enforcing racial slavery on black Africans, and the the philosophy of the Enlightenment, all the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Hegel, Kant, later Nietzsche, still really our political philosophy and our philosophy of history is still trapped in a way in that moment of not recognizing the Haitian Revolution for what it was. And I think that
one question about the Haitian Revolution is that, like in my own sort of modest awareness of that particular history, I read C.L.R. James, I have some basic sense of it. I realize that partly because of my own interest in traditional religions, in Voodoo and all this sort of stuff, that I mix the sort of occult side, the sort of ritual side of Haitian culture into my image or my imagination about the revolution. Of course, there's these famous rituals that are kind of part, as you described, partly lore, based in a little bit of fact, perhaps, but hard to read. But in general, then your book also made me recognize the way in which by spectralizing the Haitian Revolution, by acknowledging or imagining its kind of religious side or magical side, is also a way of avoiding the kind of way in which it's sort of this thorn in the side of any kind of European philosophy of history, because it goes against the grain. It's the one that reminds the white civilization about its inherent contradictions and hypocrisies, and yet can't be recognized as the libertarian nation that it also was at that point. So, how do you think about the role of religion, of traditional African religion, in the Haitian Revolution?
Yeah, well, it's an important part of the book, and it's kind of one of the most important lessons that I had in writing the book. I was something of a romantic revolutionary mystic. My orientation was quite Bataille. I had, the great fantasies of kind of, voodoo sorcery, hypnotic trance states leading to revolutionary emancipation. I no longer hold those views after having done the research. Not that I want to exclude the fact that voodoo did play a role in the revolution, but the idea that somehow, through hypnotic, sorcerous trance states, you can bring about some overthrowing of European superpowers is no longer something that I hold any faith in or trust in. But I do understand why it happened, and there's a chapter I call the Romance of Revolutionary Voodoo, and very important and central to that, and central to all my research, was this thing called the Bois Caïman ceremony, which is the event which reputedly triggered the Haitian Revolution. Now, there's historical research shows that there were certainly some events took place that was something like voodoo ceremonies, which preceded a few days before the great uprising that began what would be a 13-year revolutionary war, in which leaders from both sides swapped allegiances and all sorts of deals were done. But whatever, it was a bloody, long revolutionary war in which many people lost their lives and many people were betrayed, as all revolutionary wars tend to be. But what's important about the putting voodoo back in the heart of the revolution is, well, there's two things. Firstly, part of the Enlightenment project was this anti-superstition kind of sensibility, the enlightened sensibility. So most Haitian leaders have kind of maybe secretly practiced voodoo, but openly kind of condemned it because it was seen to be regressive in progressive historical terms. So it was denigrated not only by European and American commentators, but also sometimes by Haitians, and especially the Haitian ruling elites, who still actually, look down on and would like to see the end of voodoo. At the same time, especially during the occupation, it was during the American occupation where Haitian intellectuals and people later like C.L.R. James would see that you had to show that there were African roots to the Haitian Revolution, because it wasn't simply a question of a white European idea making its way through Masons and Republican mesmerists. into the minds of black Africans. You know, there are revolutionary traditions in Africa, there are spiritual traditions in Africa, and political traditions in Africa. And, you know, so someone like Dessalines had expertise in military expertise that were brought from being African, being black, being part of that history. So it was an attempt to bring black history, African history, belief systems into had to have a role to play in the Haitian Revolution, which of course they did. So, but that ended up kind of, I think, over-emphasizing the role of the voodoo ceremony that started the Haitian Revolution, that it almost became an entirely voodoo-initiated kind of event, which I think, you know, really kind of takes away from what revolutionary wars entail, which is, you know, the mobilization of vast numbers of people to fight in wars against other groups of people who are mobilized by people on the other side and fighting long and drawn out and bloody wars to achieve national independence.
I'm curious whether your sort of revision of your earlier romanticism has to do largely with the specific histories of the Haitian Revolution and the way in which that fantasy has both illuminated and disguised what was going on, or whether it has to do with the larger shift in your own thinking about the revolutionary potential of altered states, of transgression, of these kinds of things beyond the Haitian context.
Yeah, I think, you know, I really respect voodoo and admire it as a religion. I think it's an ecstatic religion, a shamanic religion of great depth, great insight, great beauty, like many religions, all great religions. So, but, you know, to give you an idea of how my thinking changed, my original title for this book was Undead Uprising, an Insurrectionary Grimoire. And my kind of fantasy conceit there was that I would find out who the Loire of insurrection were, find out how to summon them, and we could kind of have a grimoire for anybody who wanted to set up their own, you know, voodoo-driven insurrectionary uprising movement. And what I found is that that's what really revealed to me the limits of my own fantasy. You know, that when you actually dig into who were the spirits of insurrection that were allegedly summoned during the Haitian Revolution, and that's when you start to see that there are warring spirits like Ogun, and his, you know, Ogun Ferrai is still summoned and referred to when Haitians go into battle or struggle against an enemy. He's a warrior spirit. Of course, you're going to summon a warrior spirit when you go to war. But you know, other figures are, you know, less tangibly part of the revolutionary project. So I guess I just found that, you know, my own romance of what revolution was. You know, you read C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, and you see that, you know, a revolutionary war is a bloody, horrible thing that, you know, you never know who's going to kick your door in and, you know, and murder you for what reason. And you never know quite what side you're on when it really kicks off. So that was my kind of, I became less idealistic about revolution.
Yeah. No, that
no longer a revolutionary. I was always an armchair revolutionary.
Hey, we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to just hear a little bit about your involvement with the Ghetto Biennale in Port-au-Prince. What is your experience being bringing your ideas and your art into the context of the Haitian art in intellectual scene?
Yeah, well, that's been great. You know, the thing is, I would never have been able to write this book with any confidence, or I wouldn't have been able to write it without having spent time in Haiti and met with Haitians and worked with Haitians and understood something about the reality of life in Haiti. And so it's had a profound impact. And I think partly on making me realize that, you know, we have a lot of idealism and romance and fantasy about voodoo and its role in the revolution. But when you get to Haiti, it's just a real living religion that people believe in and practice on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, it isn't necessarily making, you know, I mean, it's a revolutionary country. It's a country whose identity is so suffused with the history of revolution that it's in the air all the time anyway. Also, so it made me kind of much more sober and realistic about the the practical reality of voodoo as an instrument for radical social transformation, both inside and outside Haiti. Again, that's not to say I've got anything against voodoo. I just don't think it's necessarily an essentially revolutionary mode of faith, practice, or ecstatic.
Great, John. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for coming on Expanding Mind and talking about Undead Uprising.
Well, thanks for having me, Erik.
Great. We'll have to have you back and talk about PKD next time. All right, for all you out there, keep your minds open.